Welcome everyone. Welcome back to the first complete Luncheon series in spring 2018. Before Bob Edwards will introduce today's speaker, I'd like to mention a couple of events that are forthcoming. First, next week's speaker for the luncheon would be Alexander Segal, professor at Queen's College in CUNY. He will speak on the evolution of an abstract proto-existentialist, the physical, mental, and spiritual in the art of Daniel Hammes. On Wednesday, Professor Richard Ali at Penn State will speak on climate change as a part of School of International Affairs lecture series at 11:15 to 12:30 p.m. in 012 CATS. Now Bob will introduce us. Today's speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Lagresa-Gonzalez.
As Rico says, welcome back. And of course, we've all come back as we were just talking to an enormous crush of work. Right, everyone's busy, so it's a great pleasure to see all of you here to take some time to have some intellectual sustenance. And I would have wished a better lunch. I'm very pleased to introduce Elizabeth Lagresa-Gonzalez as our first comparative luncheon speaker this spring. Dr. Lagresa has been a fellow at the Dahlem Humanities Institute of Freie Universität in Berlin. She's in her first year here at Penn State as a postdoctoral teaching fellow in the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. She holds a PhD in Romance languages from Harvard, where she completed a dissertation last year on counterfeiting women, economies of gender and genre in Cervantes' Romance novelas. She has published 2 studies on the drama of Louis de Vega and co-edited and translated the allegorical, autobiographical Dream Vision, Lo Somni, that I get all the parts of it together, written by the late medieval Catalan writer Bernat Metge. She has work forthcoming on masculine women, transatlantic transactions, in the prose of Catalina de Eraso and Mary Frith, and on the drama of Calderon. Her current book project is entitled From Renegades to Cannibals, Early Modern Cross-Cultural Encounters. The talk today is on money, women, romance, counterfeits, and Cervantes. Please welcome Elizabeth Lagresa.
Thank you for that very kind welcome and for showing up here on a busy semester. I wanted to start sort of by posing a bit of a fun question. How difficult could it be to be a woman in the early modern Mediterranean? If we are to trust one of Cervantes' novelas, El amante liberal, one may have to fend off an undesirable suitor, only to have to bargain and bluff to save his life. One then would risk being abducted by pirates, shipwrecked, get wrapped and resold as a novelty good, only to make it back home through craft and luck, along with lots and lots of plundered wealth. Early modern literature is filled with such references to trade, bargaining, and money, fertile sources of metaphor to illuminate questions of identity, authenticity, and value. Employing an interdisciplinary frame, I will explore the relationship between purse and person in Cervantes' reinvention of the narrative mode of romance, which was modeled after Heliodorus' Historia Ethiopica, popularized in Spain as the novela bizantina. This type of inspiration from the Greek romance has been explored by scholars such as Carol B. Johnson and Barbara Fuchs, which have encouraged a reappreciation of this often neglected narrative mode that make up Cervantes' collections of exemplary novelas. By incorporating theories of materialism that bring to the forefront the concrete socioeconomic subtext that permeate this otherwise deemed fantastical narrative mode. But even within this body of research, the ubiquitous role performed by women, principally in illicit networks of exchange, remains largely unexplored. My research intends to address this absence, bringing to light the important role performed by women within material and symbolic exchanges, investigating the intersection between gender, genre, and economic transactions. I use the term counterfeit, which I'm going to give you a formal definition, which encompasses persons and materials, writings, and images to underscore crises in the stability of both economic and identity markers during the early modern period. An embodiment of both fraud and remaking, this polyvalent and intermedial term crystallizes the complementary relationship between dichotomies like subject and object, original and copy, and also, yes, truth and fiction. As such, counterfeit emerges as a pluralistic counter-discourse that exploits fissures and reveals tensions, facilitating the subversion of divisive hierarchies. I propose that throughout Cervantes' Romance novelas, female characters are conceived as both counterfeit subjects and objects of exchange within a developing transnational mercantile economy. They circulate and interact across a whole series of borders, whether they're cultural, social, linguistic, religious, ethnic, economic, and of course geographic. These borders define the early modern period through periods of both internal and external tolerance and conflict. I maintain that it was through these transactions and cross-fertilizations that both objects and subjects accrue different forms of value and meaning, sometimes transforming themselves into conciliatory and profitable amalgams of differences. My second aim during this project drives at gaining a deeper understanding of the relationship between the multifaceted identities and the generic complexity of Cervantes' Romance novelas, a genre that allows for the coexistence of ideal fiction and historical realities. I am certainly not alone in the endeavor to build a rapport between early modern literature and monetary concerns. During the past decades, we have seen a trend of studies on the economic and material implications found in Iberian early modern fiction, and Cervantes in particular. Works, for example, such as Cervantes and the Material World by Carol B. Johnson, which greatly influenced my work, Modernidad bajo sospecha by García Tomás, Cervantes' novel of modern times by David Quint, Writers of the Market by Gilbert Santamaria, and various others. They all illustrate how thought-provoking the connections between literature and the material world are to the modern reader. This term, though vast in scope, relates in my work to theories of materialism that bring to the forefront socioeconomic subtext within fiction, and in particular to approaches aligned with new materialism, which propose a cultural theory that rethinks oppositional dualisms between the human and the inhuman, giving special attention to agency in processes of materialization. To give you an example, from the point of view of Braidotti, applying a feminist new materialist approach, and I quote, "In the political economy of phallogocentrism and anthropocentric humanism, which predicates the sovereignty of sameness in a falsely universalistic mode, my sex fell on the side of otherness, understood as pejorative difference, or as being worth less than. The becoming animal, becoming world speaks to my feminist self, partly because my gender, historically speaking, never quite made it into full humanity. So my allegiance to that category is at best negotiable and never to be taken for granted." Holbrook goes on to affirm, when feminists criticized or rejected the notion of women as mired in material embodiment, they did so because matter was deemed to be devoid of dynamism. Yet theories as Donna Haraway open paths to view an object no longer as passive matter that has to be represented. For her, meaning-making takes place on a two-way track, the exterior and the interior, the subject, subjective, object, objective, the individual, the social, and the material, as well as the symbolic, are conceptualized as co-constitutive. To begin to contextualize the broader concerns of my presentation, I wanted to offer you a concrete example. During the late 16th century, Cervantes, a Flemish Mannerist painter and draughtsman, created an extraordinary series of engravings, the new inventions of modern times, the Nouvelle Époque. In this, he represented 19 inventions or discoveries of the early modern period, which he regarded as particularly important for the age. These ranged from clockmaking and silkworm reading to book printing, oil printing, and copper engravings, attesting to the cross-cultural and inventive milieu of the period, touching on subjects of medical and navigational, astronomical, geographical relevance. His engravings highlight, among other things, the mechanical innovations that reshaped how knowledge, both verbal and visual, was produced, reproduced, and transmitted. The series is remarkable, not only in regards to its theme, which was unprecedented at the time, but also for its naturalistic and functional representation of the world. One of its most salient characteristics is that it offers a condensed, step-by-step view of the production process of most of its inventions. The result is an elaborate depiction of new technologies which simultaneously disseminate knowledge while contributing to the enrichment of the genre of representation itself. As Leah Marti posits, at the Medici court where Cervantes resided, he would have encountered objects from, text about, and images of the New World, making the prints repositories of factual and fictional information. The result is a convergence of various sources and mediums, blurring the lines between genres and art forms to reflect the changing context. Moreover, the series testifies to the transfer of material and visual culture taking place between the Netherlands and Italy, Europe, and well beyond to Asia, Africa, and America, highlighting the interconnected nature of an increasingly globalized early modern world. This is one of Cervantes' most disseminated images, and it's devoted to the discovery of America, which expanded the limits of the known world and created a new and expansive trade market, composed of both human and material exchanges. It visualizes Americos Vespucci's first encounter with America, represented as a nude indigenous woman in a hammock. In the background, cannibals who roast human flesh and exotic animals roam. The engraving represents a combination of symbolic imagery with written legends in Latin that read, Americus rediscovers America. He called her once, and thenceforth, she was always awake. And it also includes an authorial inscription, which was a bit rare as well, where he signs with his own name, his work. Now, Michel de Certeau offers a provocative description of this image in The Writing of History. And I'm going to read it to you right now. Americos Vespucci, the voyager, arrives from the sea. A crusader standing erect, his body in armor. He bears the European weapons of meaning, the cruciform staff with a banner bearing the Southern Cross, a navigational astrolabe, and a sword, each of these referring to discourses of mastery, religious truth, scientific truth, and military power. Behind him are the vessels that will bring back to the European West the spoils of a paradise. Before him is the Indian America, a nude woman reclining in her hammock, an unnamed presence of difference, a body which awakens within a space of exotic fauna and flora. An inaugural scene. After a moment of stupor, on the threshold dotted with colonnades of trees, the conqueror will write the body of the other and trace their his own history. From her, he will make history body, a blazon of his labors and phantasms. She will be Latin America. Adding to its complexity, Louis Montrose, and I'm going to share with you another image. This one, you can see that it's inverted, and this was the copies that were done by Theodore Gall. And that for a while it was thought that Gall had actually created the image and Stradamus was sort of forgotten. And Louis Montrose highlights how, in terms of the pictorial space, the scene of cannibalism, which appears pushed into the background of the image, is perspectively distanced in terms of the pictorial surface. However, it is placed at the center of the visual field, between the mutual gazes of Americus and America, and directly above the latter's outstretched arm. Thus, the interplay between the foreground and background scenes of Stradamus' compositions and Gall's inverted reprints gives iconic form to characterizing Europe's encounter with the New World, an oscillation between fascination and repulsion, likeness and strangeness, a desire to destroy and to assimilate the other. Notably, although most of Stradamus' engravings depict male figures in a realistic manner, this one deviates from the norm by featuring an allegorical representation of American feminine form, woman as the embodiment of the marginal other. Occupying a privileged place in the imagination of the viewer, the romanticized feminine as foreign and yet familiar becomes focal to understanding representations of contacts between peoples and cultures. As theorist John Wallet Scott clarifies, gender is a primary way of signifying relationships of power. Underscoring this illustration of the discovery of America, a commercial enterprise motivated by the search of new trade routes and material wealth, woman emerges not incidentally as a recurrent medium, a conduit for discourses of artistic production, material and territorial possession, and national identity. From another perspective, the feminine figure could be read to occupy an intermediary role as both thematic subject and material object within creative and imperial enterprises. The themes that emerge in recounting these engravings are reflective of broader questions that we'll be hopefully exploring as I get closer to looking at examples of what Cervantes does with his moments of encounters in his exemplary romance novelas. So the questions that I propose are these. What role do women play in an increasingly global context dominated by the mediation of semantic, material, and human exchanges? Why is money so pervasive, so essential to the denouement of the plots, and so eminently factual in its materiality within the female-centric world of romance re-envisioned by Cervantes? Lastly, how does romance represent conflicts between self and other, where the category of other subsumes subjects and objects, and what possibilities, if any, does it envision for reconciliation? First published in 1613, between parts 1 and 2 of Don Quixote, the novelas ejemplares present a level of formal and thematic experimentation that is comparable in complexity to that found in his novels. Regrettably preoccupied with the formulations of taxonomies, critics have often partitioned the 12 novelas that make up the collection into two contrasting and reductive categories, along the lines of their ascending or descending correlation to realism. As Forcione's seminal study, Cervantes and the Humanist Vision, affirms, the critical tendency that has dominated the analysis of the novelas is one of dualistic typologies, romantic and realistic, idealistic and skeptical, Italianate and Spanish, imitative and original, literary and representational. The divide tends to oppose those works belonging to what is deemed to be the more realistic realm of the picaresque to those ascribed to what is often labeled as the inversimilar and idealistic world of romance. Meanwhile, according to Safa, for example, in her work Novel to Romance, La Ilustre Fregona and La Gitanilla fall within this sort of third category of transitional text because they mix very visibly elements of both romance and the picaresque. This has led in part to a neglect in critical studies of what are considered to be the more fantastical tales, and by extension, further removed from their historical context. Not surprisingly, the careful scrutiny of Cervantes' romance novelas and the historical conditions that account for their creation and find representation in their specific fictional forms has lagged. As Forcione explains, behind that of its more realistic counterparts, giving some disproportionate importance of some over others. It is my intent we include romance novelas alongside picaresque tales as equally worthwhile areas of examination, and delve into one of Cervantes' most unequivocally Byzantine novelas as our case study, El Amante Liberal. El Amante Liberal translates as the generous lover. It begins in medias res with a separation between two would-be lovers. And as McDaniels aptly summarizes, it is the story of how an essentially good but willful young man, Ricardo, and the woman who initially detests him, Leonisa, find love and personal growth through long and difficult trials. The exceptional nature of their trials is one of the story's main sources of interest. They are captured by Turkish pirates, sold and resold as slaves, threatened with physical violation and subsequent dishonor, lost at sea in storms. They have played witness to political intrigues of the Ottoman colonial administration, and on the way to Constantinople are engaged in a terrible neighbor combat of no fewer than 4 separate factions from 3 different ships. The action of this novella unfolds as his characters traverse the Eastern Mediterranean, driven primarily by moments of encounter that take place in the islands of Sicily and Cyprus, interposing Muslim others against not Spaniards, but Christians of Italian origin. It is ruled by the specter of mediation, certainly a mediation between self and other, but one repeatedly superimposed with a mediation between duplicitous subjects and objects, underscored by a barbaric tapestry of coexisting narrative styles and concrete geographic locations, rendering the familiar foreign and the foreign familiar. According to Fuchs, the text transfers the peninsular opposition between Spaniards and Moors to a more exotic and fluid version of Christian selves versus Muslim others, ushering the North African stages more familiar to Spaniards in favor of an Eastern world in which the certainties of Spanish ideology are cast into question. The tale thus functions as a form of inverted mirror, transforming not just Italians, but also Moors into Spanish surrogates, allowing for a clearer and safer perspective to enact self-critique. When Cervantes inserts long ethnographic digressions illustrating in great detail the inner workings of the Ottoman government and its corruption, Spanish readers would have easily recognized the similar instances of fraud and vices plaguing their own Habsburg court. Another important layer to address in relation to Cervantes' presentation of the novelas ejemplares is that he readily folds the private and individual with the national. For instance, in the first lines of El Amante Liberal, he situates the reader within the concrete historical event, the fall of Chipre, Cyprus, and its capital Nicosia, from Venetian possession into Ottoman hands during the autumn of 1570. By making use of this memorable moment of significant territorial and monetary loss for Christian states as the backdrop to the sentimental lament caused by the separations of subjects from their homeland and families, Cervantes forges a connection between amorous economies and those of national cost. The Mediterranean functions in Cervantes' novelas in two capacities: as a recognizable literary space, and two, because of increased globalization, as a geography now steeped in economic and human exchanges. It is fundamental to understand that the geographic location of these isles where the action takes place, in addition to serving as metonymic surrogates or passing for larger empires, made them strategic settlements for the establishment and control of commercial trade routes across the Eastern Mediterranean. Beyond their functions as representations of competing imperial powers and ideologies, they function within Romance concretely as porous contact zones, dominated by the exchange of both subjects and objects. Often overlooked is the importance rendered by Cervantes to the inner workings of the Mediterranean, and in particular, its market for human trade and ransom created by privateering. Something Cervantes was keenly familiar with, having been captured by Barbary pirates and taken to Algiers in 1575, after fighting in military campaigns against the Turks in the Mediterranean. There, he was kept a slave for 5 years, where he was finally freed with a ransom raised by Trinitarian friars. El Amante Liberal illustrates in vivid detail the mercantile structures underpinning the commercialization of subjects. In many respects, an illicit and profitable marketplace that coexisted alongside the vast trade of material goods between East and West. This is a practice that, as Braudel explains in the Mediterranean world, and Cervantes hints at throughout the novela, was shared by both Christians and Muslims. In the past, Western historians have encouraged us to see the pirates, only the pirates of Islam, in particular the Barbary corsairs. The notorious fortunes of Algiers tends to blind one to the rest. But this fortune was not unique. Malta and Leghorn were Christendom's Algiers. They too had their bayous, their slave markets, and their sordid transactions. These human trades become a focal point in the narrative, sustaining the corsair economy, where money and people circulate and exchange hands through transnational intermediaries. Underlying these transactions is the concomitant expansion of mercantilism across Christian and Muslim realms, and the necessary development of an increasingly complex international banking system that facilitated trade between capital and captives, alighting concerns over religious, political, national, and other sources of antagonism. These exchanges, in turn, transpire concurrently and parallel the dismantling of signifiers of identity, be they national origin, religion, dress, ethnicity, language, or even proper names, by destabilizing the meaning of belongings in its two senses, as a point of origin and as property. Exposing the ambiguities of what defines self and other, home and foreign, objects and subjects, Cervantes revels in the uncertainty and negotiation between the appearance and the substance, finding productive value in the intermediary and indeterminate. Now, no figure is more elusive and vital to the novela El Amante Liberal than Leonisa. Recurrently present in all discourse, while both physically and vocally absent for most of the narration, she serves as the motor for almost all other characters' actions, which repeatedly fail to keep a hold of her through either monetary or coercive means. The first lines, dedicated to Leonisa, however, omit her name altogether, providing instead an ironic description heard through the quintessential parameters set by Petrarchan values of exemplary beauty and neo-Aristotelian precepts of harmony. La más perfecta hermosura que tuvo la edad pasada, tiene la presente y espera tener la que está por venir, una por quien los poetas cantaban que tenía los cabellos de oro y que sus ojos dos resplandecientes soles, y sus mejillas purpúreas rosas, sus dientes perlas, sus labios rubíes, su garganta alabastro, y que sus partes con el todo y que el todo con sus partes hacían una maravillosa y concertada armonía. Leonisa is presented in the text first as a well-used trope, a representation of beauty so general and objectifying is tethered to no particular subject, and yet in episodes that follow, Leonisa, who up to now has served as a passive object and a blank canvas on which to project the desires of male protagonists, is somewhat transformed. Under circumstances that are unlikely to conduce to further agency, those of being captive of Turkish pirates, we find her voice at last. Still, her voice is deferred. It is the narrator who recounts her actions. Todo esto estaba mirando Leonisa, que ya había vuelto en sí, y viéndose en poder de los corsarios, y torciendo sus manos delicadas, sin hablar palabra, estaba atenta a ver si entendía lo que los turcos decían. Though this time her silence is due to her inability to speak a foreign language, she begins to gain agency despite, or possibly in part because of the very reasons that are presented as obstacles for her. Another captive foreigner, an anonymous Italian, plays the role of translator, explaining to Leonisa that Ricardo is about to be executed for the lives he has cost the corsairs while attempting to prevent her kidnapping. Her resolution is pragmatic and highly effective. Equate the life of Ricaredo to a monetary value of greater worth to the Turks, associating his death with another great loss, because they would lose a large ransom. In effect, she is the first to commodify a subject. And although Leonisa is not bilingual, she understands the mediatory function of money and the business of ransom. Her first action in the novela attests to her familiarity with an economic system of exchanges that transcends linguistics and national barriers. As Bardell claims in Capitalism and Material Life, money is a language. It calls for and makes possible dialogues and conversations. It exists as a function of these conversations. Leonisa's economically mindful strategy proves successful and produces a dramatic change in how the corsairs see Ricaredo. Mudóles el interés la cólera. The desire for profit tempered their anger, transforming him from an enemy to valuable cargo. It is important to know the play on words, interés, interest, as a state of curiosity or concern about or attention about something or someone. In this case, focused on revenge upon a person versus any excess of advantage over and above an exact equivalent for that which is given or rendered. In other words, profit, where the human is transformed to revenue-producing capital. Ultimately, to outweigh the loss of 4 lives, the Turkish pirates determined that the loss of a 5th is not preferable to gold, and thus the value and honor and revenge is surpassed by material earnings. Subsequently, a long justification of the prices that are assigned to each of the protagonists is provided, detailing their value as stolen goods. According to Ricardo's description, el arraez principal, que era un renegado griego llamado Yusuf, pidió por Leonisa 6,000 escudos, y por mí 4,000. And there's a whole justification of why he sets these different exaggerated prices. Pidió esta gran suma, después supe, porque estaba enamorado de Leonisa y no quisiera él rescatarla, sino darle al araez de la otra galeota, con quien había de partir las presas que se hiciesen por mitad a mí, en precio de 4,000 escudos y 1,000 en dinero, que hacían 5,000, y quedarse con Leonisa por otros 5,000. Y esta fue la causa porque nos apreció a los dos en 10,000 escudos. The Greek renegade Yusuf negotiates the human cargo along with his desires in order to maximize profit. The asking price, however, is not the final one. Through a series of demands and responses, a new bargain is reached, establishing a reduced price for the captives. Leonisa for 5,000 escudos, and for Ricardo, 3,000. The narrative details afforded to the determination of their value lends credibility to the representation of the ransom market of the Mediterranean. Cervantes' first-hand knowledge of the complex price negotiations that took place for his own ransom, reaching the sum of a mere 500 escudos, highlights the exaggerated magnitude of the value attributed to the protagonist by the novela. Ultimately, the commodification of subjects is revealed as part of an organized market system where prearranged shares of the bounty are divvied up and awarded by different ranks. After the shipwreck separates Ricardo and Leonisa, where the former believes her to be dead, her reappearance is marked by a new transformation. And with her comes along a new character, which is a Jewish merchant that traffics in fabrics, of both cotton and wool and other items that he carries from the Barbary to the Levant. He also occupies a relevant position as an intermediary and an exemplar of the vast international trade of goods between East and West prevalent in the Mediterranean. With Leonisa's reintroduction, however, the focus immediately shifts to a detailed description of her exotic costumes and basically in the items in which she is packaged and presented. The miraculous rebirth of Leonisa in Moorish attire, though, is not intended as a disguise, nor is anyone led to mistakenly believe she's anything other than a Christian captive dressed as a Moor. Its purpose is to entice the audience, both characters and readers, by transforming Leonisa into a precious object to be displayed and ultimately purchased for a high value. Awestruck in asking to see her face, the audience witnesses a moment of forceful unveiling. Described again in generic terms, the focus on her beauty, however, shifts almost seamlessly into a discussion of her monetary value, naturalizing the equivalence of a person with a commercial object. Seemingly at hand, but always at a grasp, her body is put on show as a desired object for purchase, priced at $4,000, que vienen a ser 2,000 escudos. So priced at $4,000, which amounts to about 2,000 escudos, where both the bodies and the currencies find their equivalency. As is corroborated throughout the novela, for Leonisa, it is important that her appraisal be measured in an exact and balanced manner. Too little or too much are signaled out as incorrect by her. Having an estimate of her own worth in mind, she recounts how her brotherly captors oversold her for an excessive price to the Jewish merchant. She says, en el mismo bajel los turcos se fueron a Trípoli, y en el camino me vendieron al judío, que dio por mí $2,000, precio excesivo, si no le hiciera liberar el amor que el judío me descubrió. Disproving Johnson's argument that Leonisa is manipulated into commodifying herself, from its start to the end, her character readily values both herself and others in terms of commercial objects with a precise value. She's an agent of commodification, not a passive material. Once the matter of Leonora's purchase appears to be resolved, the focus shifts once again to her attire and its value. Dijo el judío que no le había de dar con los vestidos que tenía, porque valían otras $2,000. And he goes on to describe the elements of the dress and intermingles them with her person. So her person and her attire are given the same treatment by the narrator, and thus render almost of equal importance. This correspondence between her body and the items that adorn it has the effect of conflating objects with the female subject, a display for luxury goods. The description interlaces her hair, hands, and feet with pearls, illustrating her body and its adornment as precious commodities that complement each other, enhancing their mutual value. And this portrait that is painted, we have a really rich portrayal of this combination of the material and the human. And although previously described as codicioso in a contradictory term, the narrator explains that the price asked for the merchandise that adorned her by the Jewish man in possession of Leonisa is actually under market value. Having settled the terms of the transaction, $4,000 for Leonisa and $2,000 for the attire, the gift is ready and wrapped. She's intended to be a gift for the Sultan. Later on in the novela, mistaken for a ghost or cuerpo fantástico, the encounter between Leonisa and Ricardo as representatives of their Muslim masters is marked by the compulsion to counterfeit. As the novela advances towards its resolution, both Leonisa and Ricardo must undergo yet one more transformation, this time from the role of Byzantine lovers, captives, and objects of desire, into one of mediators themselves. Empowered as negotiators, speaking on behalf of their master's desires, Leonisa will represent Halimas, and Ricardo will represent the Cadiz. And they will broker in an exchange their promises and their desires through this intermediary role that they now play. Made even more explicit, Ricardo states, "It is the same for you as Halima's desire for me. He has made me the interpreter of his thoughts, the end of which our misfortunes have brought to you. You to be the intermediary for the impossible, and I to do the same for the last thing I ever thought of." The use of the term medianera, translated as intermediary, emphasizes their role as mediators in both senses of the word, as a thing that stands between two others, be it property or territories, and as a person that intercedes in favor of another to obtain something or reach an arrangement. This signals their function as both go-betweeners that transverse divisions and barriers that delimit two separate spheres. Nevertheless, it is essential to point out that what they represent above all are false intermediaries. The encounter between Leonisa and Ricardo as representatives for the Muslim masters is marked by the compulsion of these exemplary characters to counterfeit themselves, repeated incessantly in their first dialogue of the novela. And this is the very first time that they get to speak to each other. The initial request Leonisa has for Ricardo is that he lie, es forzoso que finja, and remain with the false name of Mario. Defrauding all expectations of their station, the protagonists become forgeries of themselves, recasting the semblance in a positive light, as the correct strategy that will lead to the restitution and eventual happy ending. Si yo perderé del derecho que debo de ser quien soy, y satisfaré tu deseo y el de Halima fingidamente, como dices, si es que se ha de granjear con esto el bien de verte, y así finge tú las respuestas a tu gusto, que desde aquí las firmas y confirma mi fingida voluntad. Subverting the reader's anticipations once again, Cervantes displaces Ricardo from his previous position as Virgil's storyteller to a more passive one as listener. Ricardo's first request of Leonisa is that she briefly recount how she came to change processions from the hands of Turkish pirates to those of the Jewish merchants. Occupying the role of narrator for the first time, Leonisa in turn asks for greater space to tell her story and share her perspective of the events. What follows is an unexpectedly positive portrayal of her captors, who attempted to save her from drowning and then keep her safe in an island for 8 days. The unbridled imagery associated with the Baha'is and Tariq that was provided by the other characters and the narrator as sort of the savage and lustful men stands in direct contrast to that of the respectful Turks which Leonisa has chosen to feature, foreseeably to reassure Ricardo of her chastity. Featuring another reversal of roles, Leonisa aligns her perspective with that of her captors and describes how it is now the Turks that fear for their enslavement by Christian forces, further corroborating the practice was used by both. The female point of view, however, does not alter one of the most salient aspects of the narration, its impetus to translate. When the survivors encounter a ship, Leonisa describes it as un bajel de moros que ellos llamaban caramuzales, so a Moorish ship, the kind they called caramusal. Incongruously translating in the reverse, from her original language to a foreign one, even when there is no objective need for this since she's speaking with Ricardo. Her account attests to the fact that without regard to the identity of the speaker or the audience, within this liminal setting, narration consistently includes analogies between familiar and unfamiliar terminologies. The effect is that whoever occupies the role of narrator becomes an interpreter of sorts, while his or her speech adapts to include equivalences between languages and cultures. Nearing its conclusion, Leonisa, along with the rest of the characters, engage in one last instance of counterfeiting before the return trip to the homeland. And it is a macabre imposture of costumes belonging to dead Muslims. And I leave it for you to read on so that I can get to the conclusion. I kept you long enough. Confusion rules again as the people of Cartagena, the character's birthplace, see a strange ship approaching, unable to read its identifying markers with certainty. It is only when it reaches to very close proximity that the provenance of the bajel is given away. Instead of discerning that they are fellow countrymen through their physical appearance, their language, they realize their rivals are Christians because as they disembark, they prostrate themselves and kiss the ground beneath their feet. In effect, they are performing they belong. The display, aptly described by the text as a procession, procesión, an espectáculo, spectacle, concludes with the emergence of Leonisa on stage. The final words spoken in the novela are reserved for Leonisa, where she takes charge and asks Ricardo for his hand in marriage. In the end, the happy union of the lovers is purchased by pirated wealth taken from the dead Muslims. Though the title of the novela and fame that ensues with its conclusion are ascribed to Ricardo, the final words put the focus again on Leonisa's role as a creative agent. Her capacity to reproduce children, a traditional role for women, nevertheless echoes her ability to multiply desire as well as narration. She's none other than the driver, which, although consistently deferred and displaced to the margins, returns to generate value in the business of romance. Now, to conclude, to get sort of to the broader scope, during the 17th century, international trade was rapidly evolving and building networks that brought all areas of the globe into direct contact with each other. Demand for silver, gold, spices, etc. drove trade so that products from each major global region could be virtually found everywhere else. Europeans not only moved commercial objects, but also began moving themselves and forcibly moving others into new places. While empires as Spain expanded their reach as they experienced profound economic turmoil, punctuated by numerous fiscal crises, including Spain's royal bankruptcies, which ranged from 1557 to 1647. And all of this tended to create the sense of uncertainty, of ambiguity, of a fractured state's legitimacy and authority. Spain in that juncture was plagued by an ever-growing deficit of both monetary and human resources, caused in great part by wars, disease, the expulsion of minorities as Moriscos executed between 1608 and 1614, coupled with the increased prosecution of conversos as they were championing the notion of purity of blood. Having learned nothing from the destructive effects of the expulsion of the Jewish community in 1492, the general effect on the peninsula of these newer expulsions was, if not equal in magnitude, severely detrimental to the already weak economy of the empire. As the royal confessor expressed in 1633, it is a very short time ago since the Moriscos were expelled, an action which did such harm to these kingdoms that it would be a good idea to have them back again, if they could be persuaded to accept our holy faith. During the reign of Philip II and beyond, the war against Protestants, Turks, and Dutch, along with short-sighted imperial politics, exhausted Spain's economic power, leading to financial ruin and accelerating its decline during the 17th century. As Celio elucidates in Imperial Spain, the apparently inexhaustible stream of silver from the Indies that had tempted the king to embark on a vast series of enterprises, which swallowed up his revenues and added to his mountain of debts, resulting in harsh realities of an empty treasury and an exhausted nation. In this backdrop of losses, conflict, what we see in romance is the emergence of female protagonists that are stolen and then returned home with added value. These are stories that reflect the possibilities of gains to be had with possibly more conciliatory socioeconomic approaches by representing a beneficial alternative substantiated by a rather subversive coexistence. A happy conclusion achieved through the fusion of love and money, encapsulated in feminine form. Juxtaposing traditional elements of romance with concrete economic networks, Cervantes achieves the cohabitation of what are often perceived as separate and irreconcilable realms. He does so by creating interchangeable parallels between the circulation of subjects and objects and the exchange of amorous discourse and financial argot, while placing at its center the figure of women. He mines their capacity for interruption and fragmentation and the representations of scenes of cross-cultural encounters. This is not a unidirectional move from romance to realism or vice versa, but an unresolved open-endedness, a dialectical coexistence exemplified by the combination of romance and picaresque novelas within the novelas themselves. The multiplicity of Cervantes' romance novelas and hybrid identity of its female characters, set during a period marked by vast transformations, forms a pluralistic narrative economy that reconciles variety with union. In a universe where everyone seems to be skilled in duplicity, he invites readers to recognize the similar in the foreign, the friendly in the renegade, the pleasure in the multiple, and hopefully rethink the prescriptive discourses that conform our understanding of self and other. Cervantes' romance novelas, in light of the representations of counterfeit gypsies, for example in La Gitanisha, Christians and Protestants, in Español Inglesa, Christians and Moors in El Amante Liberal, reveal how the interchange, circulation, and displacement of female identities is associated with deep socioeconomic tensions that reshaped the early modern world. Within the sphere of romance, women represent belongings, which signify both a state of being accepted in a place or group, and a thing somebody owns or has with him or her, a movable possession, blurring the lines between subject and object, self and other, and highlighting the multifaceted, fluid, and creative capacity of counterfeiting within these heroines, the world of romance, and the transnational monetary networks they navigate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have plenty of time for discussion. Any questions?
I'll start briefly. Yes, right. It seemed to me that at the very start of this really fascinating talk, for which I'm very grateful, you want to create a certain, let's call it period style, that involves that basically involves trafficking women. I mean, that's the kind of fundamental old-fashioned paradigm, you invite us to look at this for distinctive qualities of the early modern period. At the same time as you were working through the text, I kept thinking, I've actually heard this before, earlier. For example, Florence and Blanche, Boccaccio, right? Filocolo is probably one of the closest large models to what you're talking about. Right. So, what happens in the change, right, from those earlier, high and late medieval models into the early modern tellings of romance and exchange?
I think Cervantes does is he really, as he does with the novelas de caballería and the Quijote, he plays with multiple perspectives and with different sort of narrative styles. Mm-hmm. And I didn't get to sort of feature this. This is one of the longer novelas ejemplares, but he intermixes like long passages about like ethnographic descriptions, and then he'll introduce passages which are much more similar to the sentimental romance. Then he'll include whole Petrarchan discourse. This sort of multiplicity that on the one hand tends to poke fun of the very models themselves, but in reality it also provides an opportunity to see sort of the similarities between all of them, that they can be in dialogue with each other. So I think to some extent that irreverence that he presents allows for the genre of romance to escape sort of the trappings of its very format. He's constantly playing with expectations from the readers and then sort of defrauding them, delaying them. Then he talks only about sort of economic aspects. And he does this in tale after tale, so it's not just a one-off. And so yes, I would say that's one of the key elements that brings Cervantes' romance novelas sort of aside from other models. Yes.
I just have a question about, can you elaborate a little more about the counterfeit part of it?
So counterfeit, like I sort of mentioned, it's a term that can really apply to so many different things. So on the one hand, it can be like...
Just out of curiosity, do you have a word in Spanish that you were thinking for counterfeit? Because there isn't really an equivalent. I just looked it up and there's
contrahecho,
yeah.
But it's not quite, it doesn't encompass everything.
Falsificar is to counterfeit.
Falsificar, but there were times that algo contrahecho could also mean sort of the portrait that was sort of remade. But yes, in Spanish it would be sort of divided into multiple words. There is no one that encapsulates everything. And so I struggled with that a bit, just as much as I sometimes struggle with the word like performance, performático, performática, and there's still debates. But it really highlighted for me sort of this amalgam of discourses that tend to dismantle hierarchies. So for Cervantes, a counterfeit identity, or even in the stories where he actually features counterfeit goods, that's not like a negative thing. That is something that can be productive and creative. That multiplicity that exists within counterfeiting can actually lead to good outcomes. So it's not something that needs to be punished, but in the act of sometimes replicating or imitating or recreating something, you're actually enriching the discourse. So the characters having so many identities is something that then works to their advantage, not to their disadvantage.
Or like in the second part of the Quixote, like the false Quixote that's floating around.
Exactly. So in that sense, yes, he was not happy about that, for sure. That counterfeit did not please him, but overall.
But it was useful. Like it generated.
Exactly. Even when it's not desired, it still produces. So I'm very much a proponent of whether it's in translation theory, of sort of coupling the hierarchies between the original and the translator's versions. I think there's creativity in all those like recreations that can enrich both the source language and the foreign language equally. So it allows us to see new aspects, new perspectives. So that's sort of how I fell in love with the term counterfeit.
Yeah.
Yes.
So is he making a counterfeit himself of the earlier forms of romances and the travel narratives? When you were talking a moment ago about the tendency to give descriptions of different areas and things of that sort, I was thinking also of some of the medieval, not so much romances, but narratives of travel. And is he trying to combine that genre, the genre of the medieval romance, and is the result of the development of a new combined or multi-layered genre that you would also consider counterfeit?
I think, yes. I mean, at one point, of course, if counterfeit means everything, then it starts to mean nothing in particular. But I do think he, in the sense of like using those models, yes, he's using those models and sort of playing with their constituent parts and taking some and leaving out others and changing their order or the expectations of how they should be ordered. With regards, I mean, he does this from sort of the idea of counterfeiting, of presenting himself as something other than his authentic self. From the beginning, he says in the prologue, I'm the first to write novelas in Spanish. He claims this identity for himself. But he doesn't give credit at all to the Italian novelas. He doesn't give credit to the other novelas that already existed in Spanish. So he sort of elides all those origins and takes them as his own. So there's this sort of counterfeit of impersonation of himself as the original creator. And then he moves on to creating sort of an image counterfeit. He presents a self-portrait that is verbal. So there's another sort of instance of counterfeiting. And then when he gets to the stories themselves, and in particular to the Byzantine novelas that has so much travel in it, he intermingles very realistic and concrete concerns or long disquisitions about the credit economy and how a promissory note would change hands and who would need to sign it and how, the whole breakdown of the banking system within what would be expected to be a more fantastical tale. So I think I'm not sure if that fully answered your questions, but the travel narrative aspect of it allows him to sort of show his knowledge of the world, but also have multiple moments of encounters, of crossings that then create a sort of a greater complexity of the universe that might just be dismissed as sort of a formulaic romance.
Anybody else?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.